So Jake Paul just stopped Mike Perry in the 6th round last weekend. So I think now's a good time to have a conversation about which MMA fighters would have decent success in boxing translating over. To be added to this list, you have to qualify as either an MMA fighter who has fought in a boxing ring before, or a current UFC fighter who people speculate would do well in boxing. Our first fighter is going to be the only success story from MMA fighters translating over to boxing. And that is going to be Mr. Francis Ngannou. S tier is pretty obvious for Ngannou, I think, and it's the only place he can really go, because as we go down the list, we will learn that there are no other success stories in MMA crossover boxing. In fact, regardless of the Joshua fight, even though that was a bit of a bad look for Ngannou, we haven't seen anyone else on this list fight someone who's an actual elite level boxer besides Ngannou, right? And the fact that he almost beat one of them in Tyson Fury was, I think, is nuts to think about. We'll talk about Nate Diaz and Anderson Silva and Tyron Woodley, how they did against Jake Paul and their varying degrees of success. But it's only with Ngannou we can talk about a current elite heavyweight champion who he fought. But let's be real, right? If Nate Diaz fought the current boxing champion in his division, which, let's say Nate Diaz fights Canelo, right? How do you think that would go? It would not go well for him whatsoever, right? But Ngannou, he somehow just made it close versus Tyson Fury. I don't know how that happened. I still don't know how it happened, but it did happen. So he's got to go in the S tier. We move on to a fighter who we have not seen in the ring before, but we can sort of tell that he'd have success in boxing, and that is Alex Pereira, right? Alex Pereira is just an athlete where you can tell that he's bred for combat. I mean, you look at him, he's got nutty power, right? We've seen him reach the pinnacle of the sport in 2 different combat sports, which I think is pretty much unheard of. I'd say kickboxing is closer to boxing than it is to MMA, to be honest. So for him to move over and do the things he's done in MMA and kickboxing at the same time, I have no doubt that he'd be able to go over to boxing and have some decent success. Would he beat some champions? Probably not. I think his style's just a bit weird, if you ask me. I mean, he's got a bit of a zesty style where he stands a bit upright with his little bouncy chin in the air sort of low hands thing that he's got going on. I don't think that would work in the highest level. I don't think we've ever seen anyone fight that sort of way. I think that's a striking thing with kicks, but he'd do well because he's good enough at boxing with his hands to have some success in boxing. Moving on to a fighter who is the opposite of Ngannou's successful story. We have a very unsuccessful story in Tyron Woodley in the C tier. Now, I won't put him in the balls tier, even though he's 0-2 in boxing. I won't put him in the balls tier because he didn't do too bad against Jake Paul in the first fight. In the second fight, he was sort of even until the knockout. But he did get the biggest, he got slumped really bad against Jake Paul, didn't he? And that's just a bit sad, isn't it? I mean, you watch the Jake Paul fight, he just sort of stood there like a crab in this weird crab-like stance and refused to throw punches, really. He threw about, I'd say, 10 punches around across both fights. Not a very good performance, to be honest. I mean, if you're fighting by the time the first Jake Paul fight happened, Jake Paul had not had a tough fight whatsoever. So it's up to Woodley to sort of put the pressure on, make Jake Paul work on the back foot, put him in a fight that he hasn't been in before. That was his chance to beat Jake Paul, really, in that first fight, and he just stood there doing what he normally does, which is do nothing. He's the frozen one, and that's why he's in C tier. Our next fighter needs no explanation as to why he's in the tier that he is, and that is Mr. Ben Askren himself. I need to say, if you picked Ben Askren to beat Jake Paul, you are silly. You're a very silly person and you need to think about what you've done, because you can't watch Ben Askren throw punches and think, wow, he's going to win a boxing match. He's not. That was never going to happen. He's in the balls here and that's where he belongs. He was never going to win that fight. I guarantee there's plenty of you people watching this video who could beat Ben Askren in boxing. That's not an exaggeration. I know there's some of you who've never fought a day in your life. I'm telling you now, you would still beat Ben Askren in a boxing match. He is genuinely that bad. At a certain point, it does not matter whether he was a good UFC fighter or not. If you can't throw a punch, you can't throw a punch. That's how it is. Moving on, we have our first B-tier entry, and we have the middleweight Sean Strickland. Now, Strickland's a weird one because he does not look like a good striker on the eyes, like a good boxer either, to be honest. The best thing about him, I think, striking-wise, is his defence. Like, his strength is his defence, I think, because he doesn't really punch at all. His punches are silly technique. They don't look like they hurt you whatsoever. But his defence, he's just really hard to hit. I doubt his ability to win a boxing match in those 10-ounce gloves against a genuinely good opponent. He could survive against someone who's really good. Do you know what I mean? Like, let's say Sean Strickland boxes Caleb Plant, right? He'd probably go the distance, or at least go really far in that fight, to be honest, just because of his natural defensive reflexes, right? I think at Strickland's level on this tier list, I think we're getting to fighters who would beat Jake Paul in a boxing match. I'd pick Strickland over Jake Paul. I won't be completely confident in him like I would with Ngannou or Pereira, but I think he'd beat Jake Paul. Right, moving on, my next placement is going to be very controversial, right? And that is going to be Mr. John Jones. Tell you what, I might just put him in balls tier, to be honest, just to make it more funny. Yeah, I am. John Jones, yeah. This is the thing with John Jones. John Jones fans have this idea that because he's a really good MMA fighter, he's Superman, basically. He can do anything, right? There's one thing he can't really do, even in MMA, and that's punch. He's not knocked out a single opponent in the UFC with a punch, right? That has never happened, right? He's maybe dropped 2 opponents in the UFC with punches, and that's, for the amount of fights that he's had, that's a terrible number. Do you know what I mean? Every other knockout that he's got, every finish he has, it's a submission or it's a ground and pound type TKO, right? He's got 2 knockdowns for him in his career that aren't head kicks, right? One of them's Rashad, who I think was an elbow, and there was Machida with a little left overhand that he landed as Machida was coming in. Besides that, he throws weird little sloppy punches that don't look like they hurt you whatsoever, right? I think Woodley is a better technical boxer than John Jones. I think he punches better than John Jones. That's why he's a tier above John Jones. I would pick a lot of boxers who aren't really boxers to beat John Jones in a boxing match. I'd pick Tommy Fury to beat John Jones in boxing. I'd pick KSI even to beat John Jones in boxing. That'll make a lot of John Jones fans upset if they were to watch this video. That does not matter. John Jones can smell my balls. He's going in the balls tier. Moving on, we've got a much more respected fighter to cross over to boxing. And he's not really embarrassed himself either. He's done pretty well for himself. We've got Anderson Silva. Anderson's going in the B tier. I can't really put him in the A tier because he's not really... Despite beating Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., boxing does not claim Chavez Jr. Do you know what I mean? So I don't think that's a massively impressive win to have. I mean, we just saw Uriah Hall almost beat Chavez last night on the Jake Paul undercard. So we can't start calling him a former world champion like it's a really good achievement. There's plenty of random guys like Buddy. There's influencer boxers who would beat Chavez Jr. Jake Paul would beat Chavez Jr. I fully believe that. He gave a decent fight to Jake Paul. I feel like people don't really mention that fight, but Silva did pretty well for himself in that fight. I'd say about 3 rounds out of the 8 that happened. That was decent. He got knocked down at the end, but he made it the distance, did a bit better than Woodley did. He did push Jake Paul in that fight. He's got a couple other boxing matches as well. I feel like if he picked up boxing from a really early age instead of MMA, he would have been like champion level because he's got that natural athlete talent about him. You know, with his head movement, his accuracy, his speed, all of that. He's good. He's going in the B tier. Moving on to another fighter who we have not seen in the ring before. That is going to be Sugar Sean O'Malley. Now, I think he'd actually do very well for himself in a boxing match, to be honest, just looking at his talent as a striker with his hands, right? Now, do I think it's silly talk when he's talking about beating Ryan Garcia and Tank Davis? Yes, I do. He would not beat Tank Davis or Ryan Garcia. In fact, he'd get knocked out in about 3 rounds at least. But he's a very talented striker. He's got good hands, very fast hands, powerful hands. And he's one of those guys, like I said about Anderson Silva, if he picked up boxing first instead of MMA, he would be a very good boxer. He'd be a top 10 level type boxer, right? You can sort of see in his style. He'd be a bit of a slickster, like outside, Junto Nakatani type boxer if he was in the ring. He'd do pretty well. I'd put him in the A tier. Another UFC fighter that gets mentioned alongside Sean O'Malley would be Petr Yan, who's also in the A tier right next to him. There was a discussion for a long time about Petr Yan being the best boxer in the UFC, and there's still a case for it. Like, if you think Petr Yan beat Sean O'Malley in their fight, he's got a case for being the best boxer in the UFC still. I'd put Sean O'Malley above him, though, just in terms of pure boxing, because I think Sean's style is a floaty sniper sort of boxer that suits a boxing ring more than Petr Yan's style. Because Petr Yan, he's sorted his MMA striking style to fit MMA, as opposed to being able to cross over to boxing, because it's got a very Muay Thai type of stance going on, very Muay Thai based. A lot of kicks are involved. But regardless, A tier is where he goes, because I'd put him, if you just watch his form, he's much better than Strickland is, and he's much better than Anderson Silva is, who are in the tiers below him. So I think A tier is solid for Petr Yan. Our next entry is someone who I think has surprised everyone in terms of how well he's done in boxing, contrary to everyone's expectations of him before he started boxing, and that is Nate Diaz. I was in the boat of people that thought that Jake Paul was about to knock out Nate Diaz in the first 3 rounds. Right, I thought, based on the Tony Ferguson fight that Nate just had before he left the UFC, there's no way he survives a fight with a much bigger, faster, more explosive Jake Paul, but somehow he won some rounds in that fight. I don't know how he did. This is the thing with Nate Diaz. He looks absolutely terrible. The way he punches, his speed, his technique, everything, it looks rubbish, but he's just somehow has success against people with better technique than him. He beat Masvidal the other week. You can argue Masvidal won. I can completely see it. I think Masvidal maybe should have edged it out 6 rounds to 4. But regardless, he shouldn't have been doing as well as he was, considering how bad his form is. But he is, so we've got to live with it. I'll put him in B tier because I'd say in terms of how close the fight was, it was a bit. It's about the same with Anderson Silva as it was with Nate Diaz against Jake Paul. So, put him in B tier. Did better than Woodley. Now we move on to a fighter who I believe is the actual best boxer in the UFC right now. And that is the featherweight champion, Ilia Topuria. Now you can make the case for a lot of fighters being the best boxer in the UFC. Sean O'Malley, Petr Yan, Alex Pereira, other guys on this tier list, but the only fighter in MMA who stands out to me as someone who throws punches like a boxer does is Ilia Topuria. Especially because he has the stance of a boxer. He's got his lead leg forward, he's got a high guard, he's very conventionally boxery for an MMA fighter, which I think would make him very successful in boxing, to be honest. He's one of those guys I believe would be a genuine, elite level boxer if he were to do it. Not that he could beat an elite level boxer if he moved over right now, but if he was to start doing boxing instead of MMA, he would be an elite level boxer right now. And we'd be talking about him among names like Tank Davis, Errol Spence, Terence Crawford, all these guys. I fully believe he's on that level boxing wise. Another fighter that we're going to add to the S tier, we've also never seen in a boxing ring before, but I can You can sort of tell he'd be really good, and that is Tom Aspinall. The main reason I've put him on the S tier along names like Ilia Topuria, even though I think technically he's not as good as Jan O'Malley Topuria in a boxing sense, it's more to do with the fact that he is a heavyweight, right? And the bar to be a good heavyweight is not that high. The thing with heavyweight is it's all an athleticism thing. If you're a good athlete, you can get very far in either MMA, heavyweight MMA, or heavyweight boxing. And Tom Aspinall has everything he needs to be a good heavyweight boxer, right? He's got very good hand speed, very good foot speed. He's a very fast individual. He's got great head movement, accuracy, speed, power. He's very powerful. Great reflexes. Like what more do you need in a boxer? Because he could move over right now. There are boxers in boxing right now who started boxing around the same age as Tom Aspinall is now. There's a lot of old heavyweights out there. So I believe he could fully move over right now and maybe make a name for himself. Maybe make it to the top 10, who knows? Because let's face it, there's guys like... If guys like Jermaine Franklin can make it to the higher levels of heavyweight boxing, Aspinall can do it. Do you know what I mean? So, S tier for him. Our next fighter is someone who's been claimed by many to be the best boxer in the UFC right now, by a lot of people, and that is Mr. Max Holloway. Now, do I think it's silly to call him the best boxer in the UFC right now? Yes, I do, because he clearly got outboxed by Volkanovski in their third fight, and also got outboxed by Dustin Poirier. But, you know, he's a good boxer though, do you know what I mean? He's very good. He's improved since those fights, I think. But has he improved enough to be the best boxer in the UFC? No, I don't. I also don't think he'd do that well in an actual boxing match, just because of how little he hits. Do you know what I mean? I know he's sort of improved his power a little bit. He's sitting more on his punches. But he does not have natural power that could translate over with 10-ounce boxing gloves. So we can't put him too high. I'd put him above Silva and Diaz just because them two are just old as hell right now. Put him below Strickland because Strickland's got really good defence. Holloway doesn't really have much in the way of defence, to be honest, even still. He's definitely gotten better. That's something that people need to mention. Holloway's gotten a lot better in the past couple of years. But is he the best boxer? No, I don't. Would he do the best in boxing? I don't think he would, but he'd do pretty well. Our next one's very hard to place just because we don't... Not only do we not know what he'd look like in a boxing ring, we also don't know what he'd look like in a UFC fight because he hasn't fought in about 3 years. And that is the Mac himself, Conor McGregor. I'm going to put him in the B tier, just below Holloway, because, I mean, historically, he is one of the best boxers, if not the best boxer in the UFC on his day. He did box Floyd Mayweather, and depending on your opinion of that fight, you might think he did well, or Floyd was doing what he was expected. He took his time, basically played with him. I lean more towards the second opinion, so I can't really wear that one that much. But you can sort of tell he's got a natural talent for his hands, right? So he would do well in a boxing match. Do I think I do think the sparring stories between him and Paulie Malignaggi are exaggerated, to be honest. If he beat the hell out of world champion Paulie Malignaggi, he'd release the full video, which he hasn't done. So he's good. You can tell he's talented. He'd do well in a boxing match. I just don't think he'd do that well, especially at this stage of his career where he's on the sniff too much. He drinks too much. He's not going to do exceedingly well. Now, our last addition on the list is going to be the most recent addition to the MMA Fighters crossover boxing situation, and that is going to be Mr. King of Africa himself, Mike Perry. Now, I'm going to put him in the C tier because, let's be real, he didn't do much better than Tyron Woodley. To be honest, I could put him below Tyron Woodley because that fight was pretty one-sided, but I'll give him the credit for fighting the best version of Jake Paul we've probably seen at this point, because Woodley fought Jake Paul about almost 3 years ago now. That's a long time ago. He'd get the Mike Perry treatment if he fought him today, I think. So we'll put him just above Woodley. Not much to say about Mike Perry, to be honest. You can't block punches with your face in a boxing match. It works in BKFC, it doesn't work in boxing, to be honest. But he's not absolutely terrible. He landed the occasional punch. You know, I'd be interested to see a Mike Perry versus Nate Diaz fight. That'd be a funny one. See how it goes. So that's it. End of the video. Goodbye. See ya.